lot of people from all over joining us tonight. I've seen a few places. If people could maybe type into the chat where you're from, it'd be nice to get an idea how diverse our group is. There's Virginia Beach, United Kingdom, Raleigh, Portland, Oregon. I saw something from Seattle. Look at that. This is really great. Canada, London. Gee. I hope everybody sees the some of these flowing through here. Ohio, California, DC area, Michigan, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Denver, Washington, Savannah, Maryland, Philadelphia. Boy, it's great. This is an interesting community. I think we all have an appreciation for the fact that there are more than just a combination of cells and bioelectrical signals, chemical signals flowing through our brains. This is a community that is going to appreciate tonight's presentation. Hopefully most of you know who Bruce Greyson is. If you don't, Jan Holden from the International Association of Near-Death Studies will be introducing him a little bit later. We have a number of sponsors tonight, and I'm going to be introducing each of them. They'll have a little time to tell you about their organizations. Probably most of you know most of these organizations, but you'll get a chance to maybe learn a little something. I'm going to start by talking about Consciousness Cafe. We are a new group that about 7 of us currently working on it. We have a website called consciousness-cafe.com. And our mission is to try to provide information that educates people about a variety of subjects, near-death experiences, after-death communications, reincarnation, just to name a few. We also attempt to bring people together that have interests in subjects. And part of it is doing events like this, bringing in interesting speakers. So if you go to our website, you'll have a chance to either join our organization, it doesn't cost anything, or at least sign up for our newsletters and learn about new presentations that are going to be coming up in the next month. So we're kind of excited to be a facilitator for this. I want to introduce John Kruth from the Rhine. John, do you want to pick it up from here and talk about what the Rhine Center is up to?
Hi, Jim. Well, thank you for inviting me here. It's been really interesting following the Consciousness Cafe. It's been growing, and I can see we're really growing tonight. There's a lot of people here. So it's nice because I've known Jim for a long time, and I've watched the Consciousness Cafe grow from an idea into its first fruition here because Jim has been a member of the Rhine for quite a number of years. The Rhine Research Center is in Durham, North Carolina, and it's the oldest continuously operating parapsychology laboratory in the country. It's in Durham. We've been doing this, the work started at Duke University, and the Duke Parapsychology Lab started in 1935. And we are continuing to do laboratory research, peer-reviewed publications in journals, and doing top-notch research, scientific research into the field of parapsychology. Everything from ESP, where the ESP cards that you might have seen originated, to moving on to psychokinesis, mind-matter interaction, looking at remote viewing, looking at healing, energy healing, trying to look at the body and the biofield, the human biofield, and what that means and what makes it up. Not only has Orion been doing this work for so long, but we've also been very interested in trying to make connections with other organizations and bring it together so that we can all work together to try to answer some of these questions about these experiences that so many of us have. I find that many times what our job turns out to be is acting as translators, trying to help the scientists in their own language understand these experiences we've been having, and at the same time trying to help experiencers understand what the scientists have been discovering along the way. So the Rhine has many events that we offer as well. You can go to rhine.org. That's our website. We have educational classes we offer. We have monthly meetings and we have events that we sponsor as well. Check it out. I hope you find something that interests you. Thank you again, Jim.
Thank you, John. Mark, can you start up there we are. The next sponsoring organization that is involved is the Monroe Institute. We had hoped that Scott Taylor would be here this evening, but he was called away at the last minute. So I'm going to do my best to talk a little bit about the Monroe Institute. I've been there on several occasions participating in their programs. Robert Monroe began this effort at studying out-of-body experiences many years ago. And he has built an interesting program to use sound technology, initially binaural beats, but they've been developing their own technology to try to put people into altered states of awareness and experience a broader reality than what we normally experience. So these programs are fascinating. They are expanding their reach now, trying to bring in some future meditation, maybe less expensive, but reaching out to a broader populace with their programs. So it's an interesting organization located in the Virginia area. I'd suggest visiting their website, the Monroe Institute, learn more about them, or buy one of Robert Monroe's 3 books, fascinating books about his experiences. So I want to now bring in Jose Hernandez. Jose, you want to talk a little bit about your sponsor role in inner immersion?
Sure. Thank you, Jim. And I'm just going to start by saying that I am an experiencer. I had a near-death experience 21 years ago, and I had a real difficult time integrating. And what happened was one of my psychologists was fortunate enough to know of the IONS organization in Fort Lauderdale, where I lived, and actually took me to attend one of their events. And I know at that time, Dr. Bruce Greyson didn't know me in any way, shape, or form, but he would have no idea how he was able to change my life in a good way and put me on a path that actually led to the Inner Immersion program. It's a program that I developed based on my experience of death, integrating the colors that I saw, the living colors that I saw. So I started to paint and capture what I saw and put them on a canvas and into virtual format. And I've been blessed in the way that I've been working with several hospitals now. We're putting together 2 incubators for research so we could see the impact that the art has on wellness and the capacity to heal without the use of medications. I just did a collaboration with the Monroe Institute to integrate their technology with the moving images and the living art to create meditations and see how we begin to deliver them to the community. And last but not least, I got involved with the Johns Hopkins Hospital, and we're working on a virtual reality program that seems to be quite robust. So please visit my website. It's innerimmersion.org, and you could learn a little bit more about the things I'm doing, but you could see the art and the programs that we offer. A lot of them are end-of-life based, but I think they're focused on what I did post experience, what I did with that experience and how I'm trying to help people with that. And it's been a blessing. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Jose. I find it fascinating to follow the trajectory of Jose's experiences, taking what he learned in his near-death experience and now trying to bring something of benefit to the general population. I think that's where all our sponsors, in varying, differing ways, we're interested in benefiting mankind. And I'd like now to introduce Jan Holden. Jan is the president of the International Association for Near-Death Studies. Jan is a good close friend and fellow researcher who knows Bruce better probably than anybody else in this group. So Jan, would you please talk a little bit about IANS, and then you can transition into your conversation with Bruce.
Great. Thanks very much, Jim. Yeah, it was wonderful to hear Jose talk about how joining the IANS group in Fort Lauderdale was pivotal in his integration process. And that's one of the International Association for Near-Death Studies goals. Our mission is to advance global understanding of near-death and related experiences through research, education, and support. And Jose was talking about the support part. When the organization was founded, we just celebrated our 40th anniversary. The founders, who, by the way, include Bruce Greyson, he was one of the 4 primary co-founders of the organization. And when it was founded, the main goal at that time was research, because at that time, near-death experiences had just been kind of identified as a phenomenon, and there had been no research beyond the beginning work of Raymond Moody. And so this group wanted to do more research, and that research has, although it wasn't their intention per se to do this, it has ended up legitimizing the phenomenon of near-death experiences, both the patterns that are in the experience and the after effects that follow certain patterns as well. And so the organization has fostered and supported research, also education, for example, education of healthcare providers, so that people do not have harmful experiences when they disclose their NDE to a healthcare provider. And that could be not only medical, but a mental health provider, a spiritual or religious healthcare provider. All of them have a role in responding helpfully, not harmfully, to near-death experiencers. And then the support aspect, we have local groups, I think more than 70, somewhere between 70 and 80, most in the US, but also around the world. And these groups tend to meet once a month, and they're for people who've had near-death experiences or related experiences, which can include things like after-death communication, past life memories, mystical experiences. And it's a place where they can talk about their experiences in the presence of others, many of whom, maybe most of whom, have had similar experiences, and proceed in the process of integrating their experiences into their lives. So a lot of this is accomplished now during the pandemic through ISGO, which is IANS's online platform. And ISGO programs occur very regularly, several times a week, including the online groups for support and other kinds of educational presentations. So I just welcome everyone to come to the IANS website and mouse around and see what you can find that might be of interest or value to you. It's just www.iands.org. And I'm going to guess that Daniel will put that up on. Oh yeah, Daniel's already put it into the chat box. So this is an easy transition, because, as I said, Bruce was one of the founders of the organization, and that's part of what I think we're going to hear about tonight. So Bruce, whenever you're ready, come on, and we'll proceed. As many of you know, Bruce is recently retired from the University of Virginia, where he held an endowed chair, and for decades has been researching near-death experiences. And I'll say too that over the years, my colleagues and I have done a few analyses of the peer-reviewed literature on near-death experiences. So that's like academic journals that have published articles on near-death experiences. And one of the things we've looked at is what authors have published the most. And Bruce is hands down the leading near-death researcher in terms of publications in academic peer-reviewed journals. He truly is the lead researcher in this field. So those of you listening are in for a treat to really hear from from the expert on near-death experiences. So Bruce, why don't you start by telling us about how the NDE movement and field got started and how you got started into it.
Sure. Thank you, Jen. That was a beautiful introduction. Um, I was sort of dragged kicking and screaming into the near-death movement. I had no real spiritual or religious tradition to follow before I discovered NDEs. And I actually discovered them pretty much by accident. I had gone through college and medical school with a materialist mindset. The physical world is all there was. And when you die, that's the end. And that was fine with me. And then shortly after I finished medical school, I was in my internship in psychiatry. And I was asked to evaluate a patient who had overdosed in the emergency room. And I went down to try to talk to her, and she was unconscious. I could not arouse her. So I talked to her roommate instead and got background information. And I arranged to see this patient when she eventually awoke the next morning. And when I saw her the next morning, I introduced myself, and she surprised me by saying, "Yes, I know who you are. I remember you from last night." And I didn't know what she meant by that, because I couldn't understand how it could be. So I said to her, "I'm surprised. I thought you were asleep when I saw you last night." And she said, "Well, not in my room. I saw you down the hall talking to my roommate." And that I just couldn't imagine what she was talking about. The only way that could have happened is if she had left her body and followed me down the hall. And that made no sense. As far as I could tell, I was my body. How can you leave it? But I couldn't deal with my own confusion. I had to deal with hers. So I focused on her and tried to get from her what was leading up to her overdose and so forth, and treating her like any other psychiatric patient. And as the days went on, I tried to convince myself that it didn't really happen. Maybe I misheard what she said, misinterpreted it. Maybe somebody was playing a trick on me because I'm a green intern. And I didn't tell anyone else. I was too embarrassed to tell anyone about this. So I just sort of pushed it out of my mind. And then several years later, Raymond Moody joined me at the University of Virginia. And he had just written a book in 1975 called Life After Life, in which he gave us the word near-death experience and described what these experiences were like. And that was my first indication that what this patient had told me a few years earlier was not just one story from one psychiatric patient, but part of a phenomenon that millions of people around the world who are perfectly normal people were describing. I still couldn't understand it. It still didn't make sense in terms of my worldview. But as a scientist, I couldn't deny that it happened. And as a skeptic, I really had to challenge my own belief system as well as anyone else's, and say, I need to understand this, so I need to study this. And here I am 50 years later, still trying to understand it. So what happened after that was that several people started writing to Raymond saying that they wanted to study near-death experiences as well. And so Raymond got a group of them together at the University of Virginia. His friend John Audette, a medical sociologist, coordinated the meeting. And he got together some 15 or 20 people who were interested in studying near-death experiences. And they included psychologist Ken Ring and cardiologist Mike Sabom. And out of that group, we eventually formed what became the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And the primary movers were Ken Ring, who was the president, myself, John Audette, and Mike Sabom. We tried to get Raymond interested, and he said, "I'm not interested in organizations. I'm not an organization person. And besides, I'm a resident. I need to focus on my practice." So he sort of let us take the ball. And Ken Ring sort of took over, and he became the president of IONS. And here we are, Jan. Now you are leading the organization.
Yeah, it's just amazing how our lives have interwoven over the years, because you also, I know another aspect that may be hidden to a lot of people is how you have mentored people into the field of research in near-death studies. And I'm a perfect example. And I can remember when I first contacted you, like 30 more, maybe 40 years ago, about to do my doctoral dissertation, and you helped me. You let me you gave me access to your near-death, your like stable of near-death experiencers to answer my survey. and then published my first article in the Journal of Near-Death Studies based on my dissertation, and that was the start of my career in this field. So I know I'm not alone, that many people have benefited from your mentorship, and as well as I know that you there's a story behind the beginning of the support groups as well.
Yeah.
You want to tell that?
Well, let me take a step back and talk about the journal itself, because you mentioned the Journal of Near-Death Studies.
Yeah.
And that's got a good story behind it. When we started IANS, there's a fire out there. Ken Ring wanted to start our own journal. And I thought that was a terrible idea. I argued against it. I thought if we have a journal, no one's going to read about us. We need to force our researchers to publish in the mainstream journals so everyone else will see what we're talking about. And I lost the argument, and Ken started the journal. And a year later, he got a sabbatical from where he was teaching at the University of Connecticut. And he asked me if I would take over the journal for that year while he was gone. And, trying to be a good citizen, I said, sure, I'll take it over for a year. And when he came back, he said, I don't think I want to do that anymore. It's yours. So there I was with the journal, trying to keep it alive for Ken's sake and for the sake of IANS. And I discovered that it was fun, in fact. And a lot of the people who had the best research were graduate students like you were at the time. A lot of nursing students had great research going, but they really weren't good at writing it up for a professional journal. So I started getting involved with helping them along the way and mentoring them how to do this. And that became really a work of love for the journal for many years. And it wasn't until I think it was 27 years of doing this before I finally tricked you into taking it over for me.
Yes, you did. And trick is a good verb for that. Yeah, so I've been doing it now for over 10 years as well. And I agree with you. It's fascinating. And even now, there's still a place for the journal, even though, fortunately, near-death research has gotten into mainstream journals, and increasingly so. It's a very much accepted topic now. And I really think that you have been instrumental in facilitating that shift. So that's been a great contribution.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then about the support groups.
Yeah. Well, I was working at the University of Connecticut at that time in the early 1980s. And I had some people who referred to me because of their near-death experiences. People got to know that I was writing about this material. I had published some articles in mainstream medical and psychiatric journals about it. So people eventually got referred to me when they were having trouble after a near-death experience. And I was working with a couple of these people individually in psychotherapy, and I wasn't getting very far with them. And I think that part of the reason was that they felt that since I'm not a near-death experiencer, I can't really understand what they were going through. And I knew at the time that Kim Clark, now Kim Clark Sharp, but then Kim Clark, had started a support group for IANS in Seattle a few years earlier that had been very successful. So I thought, why don't we do that here in Connecticut? And my wife, Jenny, and I got together with some of the other people. One was Joe Gerasi and his wife, Joan. And several of us, I think there were 4 or 5 of us, started a support group in Farmington, Connecticut. One of us put an ad in the Hartford Courant, the newspaper, and we had, I think, 30 people the first time we met. And the group has been meeting once a month. It still is meeting now, some 40 years later, with about 30 people every month coming to talk about their experiences. And we've had not only the experiences, but their families coming as well. One fellow in particular was a 17-year-old who was electrocuted and had a very dramatic near-death experience and had a terrible time adjusting to high school life after this profound spiritual experience. So he came with his parents, and after a few months, he decided he got what he needed from the group and felt much better. But his parents kept coming for years because they didn't understand what happened to their son.
Wow, that's great. And I've been leading a group like this in the DFW area for maybe 15 years. And I would say the thing that people say most often about the group is, I can talk about things in here that I can't talk about out there. that there's a special understanding between people who've had similar types of, it doesn't have to be an NDE per se, but NDEs include out-of-body experiences, mystical experiences, after-death communication, past life memories. And so people who've had those kinds of experiences, it just seems like they can relate to each other in a special way. So it's a good reminder for health professionals that we can do some things, but maybe not everything for people who've had experiences like this. Yeah. So, well, would you like to say anything about how research has progressed in the field over the years?
Sure. When we first started doing the research, it was mostly just listening to the stories people told us. And while they're fascinating, they're individual stories, and there's just so much you can do with that. As a scientist, I can't look at any one experience as being proof of anything because there are so many intervening variables, people's cultural background, their religious background. So what you really need to do is collect a large number of experiences, hundreds, if not thousands, and then look at the recurring patterns that recur again and again throughout the experiences, despite people's age, gender, race, religion, religiosity, culture. And the things that are consistent across all those variables are the things you want to look at as being the essential part of the near-death experience. So a few of us got involved with collecting large numbers of near-death experiences and doing statistical analyses of the various features they reported. Now, one of the problems was we were all working in isolation. I was at one university, Ken was at another, Mike Sabon was at another, and so forth, and they were spread all over the country. In fact, some were in other countries. Each studying what we wanted to study, which means we weren't asking the same questions. Some of us were interested in the religious aspects. So they would ask about seeing God. Others were interested in the paranormal aspects and would ask about leaving the body or having precognitive visions. Others were interested in the way people's thinking changes during an NDE, thoughts going faster and faster, time slowing down, having a life review, and so forth. So I wasn't really sure that we were all studying the same phenomenon because we were asking about different parts of it. So we decided that we needed some consistency. And I searched through the literature, which was quite sizable by that time. And I've included things that were published before Moody wrote his book that weren't called near-death experiences, but we could recognize them now. For example, Russ Noyes, a psychiatrist at Iowa, published several articles in the early 1970s that he called dissociation in the face of life-threatening danger. And what he described are very clearly near-death experiences. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I collected a list of the 80 most common features people reported. And I sent that list around to other researchers and said, which ones of these do you think are the really important ones and which ones are duplicating each other? And they whittled it down somewhat. And then I gave the list to, I think it was 75 near-death experiencers and had them look at the list and decide which ones were important and which ones were duplicates. And then when they did that, I took it back to the researchers again. And then I went back to the near-death experiences again. I went back and forth several times until we got down to 16 features that everyone agreed were the important parts of the NDE. And we made that into a scale I called it the NDE scale, very creative. And it's become kind of the gold standard. It's been translated into 20 different languages now and used in thousands of studies all over the world. And that's the way people not only define, but quantify near-death experiences now for their research. Mm-hmm. I should add, though, that this is a great tool for research. It's not particularly helpful for dealing with an individual experiencer. If someone comes close to death, has a profound spiritual experience, and is changed afterwards, but doesn't score highly on my scale, I can't say you didn't have a near-death experience. They obviously did, but they might not be included in the research because they don't fit the pattern of everyone else's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. And maybe in a nutshell, you could summarize what the patterns are within NDEs and the patterns of after effects. And I'm, of course, being facetious when I say in a nutshell, because there's a lot to say about that. But right. But for many of our viewers probably are not familiar with NDEs. And so anything you could, and it's a preview of what's in your book. So yeah, a little of that.
Well, it's just very generally, the near-death experience includes things like a sense of leaving the physical body when it is unconscious, having a sense of overwhelming peace and well-being, often leaving the physical realm and finding yourself in a different dimension or realm that seems otherworldly. And it's suffused by a sense of bliss and love. And you often confront what they say is a living being of light that's radiating warmth and acceptance, and you feel protected and welcomed by this being. They may also see other entities they identify as deceased loved ones. They often review their entire lives, and at some point make a decision to come back to life or are told to come back against their will. And then as a psychiatrist, what's most interesting to me has been the way it changes people's lives. And they often have a very consistent pattern of after effects, which include less interest in worldly things like material possessions, power, prestige, fame, competition, and more interested in the spiritual things, so to speak, getting along with other people, being compassionate, caring, unconditional love, or trying to achieve that. And that doesn't mean, though, that they no longer enjoy material things. They just don't get addicted to them and committed to them the way some of us do before an NDE.
Yeah. And because I remember many near-death experiencers talking about one of the lessons they came back with was that we are meant to enjoy this life.
Right.
But it's a difference between being able to enjoy it and not become too attached to it.
Right. One of the most pervasive after effects they report is losing their fear of death.
Yeah.
No matter what they say happened to them in this other world, they say it's not something to be afraid of. And when I first heard that, I got concerned as a psychiatrist that this is going to make people suicidal. Because I knew lots of people who had been toying with the idea of ending their lives, but were prevented from doing that by fear of what might happen if they killed themselves. So, of course, being a scientist, I did a study of this. And I interviewed patients who were admitted to my hospital after a suicide attempt and compared those who had a near-death experience as a result of the suicide attempt with those who didn't. And what I found was that those who had a near-death experience became much less suicidal than those who didn't have an NDE. And that seemed counterintuitive to me because they were no longer afraid of dying. And when I asked them why that was, they said things like, when you're not afraid of dying anymore, then you're not afraid of living either. You're not afraid of diving into the fullest, enjoying everything you can, taking risks, because you're not afraid of losing this life. So you go ahead and give it everything you've got, and you live more in the present. And that makes life much more fulfilling, much more meaningful, which is a powerful preventive for future suicidal thoughts. Mm. They also report a sense of we're all in this together, and that I'm part of something much larger than just this one bag of skin. So the problems I had that made me want to take my life before no longer seem as important. Now they see them as something to learn from and grow from, not something to run away from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that fits my sense too. One of the themes that they often come back with a sense of greater purpose in life. And the purpose includes advancing in their capacity to love, acquiring knowledge, and using adversity as a way to grow in those ways. So it's kind of like there's a gift in adversity if we know how to extract it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that can be a challenge.
Sure.
Yeah. If the life you led before the near-death experience was not compatible with the values you came back with, that can create real havoc. One example is a friend of mine in Connecticut, Steve Price, he was always a schoolyard bully, and his goal in life was to become a Marine. He was really a hard-driving macho guy, and he got to do that. He became a sergeant in Vietnam, and one day he was in a firefight and received bullets to his chest, and had shrapnel throughout his lungs. And he had to be air evac'd to a hospital in the Philippines. And during surgery there, he had a blissful near-death experience. And when he came back from that, he was a totally transformed person. He felt compassion for everybody. He was, of course, rehabilitated and then sent back into Vietnam and found that he could not fire his rifle. The idea of killing someone was just unthinkable to him. So he ended up leaving the Marines, coming back to the States and training to become a medical technician. And I've heard this again and again from people who were involved in careers that were not compatible with their NDE values, from policemen who couldn't shoot somebody after this, from cutthroat businessmen who couldn't stand the idea of getting ahead at someone else's expense after the NDE. And they didn't necessarily give up the business world, but they worked in a much more compassionate way towards their clients, their employees, and their customers. It's a different way of doing the stuff that you're doing.
Mhm.
I've seen people who were in career criminals and who were addicts who totally transformed their lives after an NDE.
Mm.
That's not easy to do. It wreaks havoc in your life and sometimes in your relationships. And we've also seen relationships break up because of these changes.
Mhm. Yeah. And then I know you were pioneering as well in the identification of distressing near-death experiences, that there's about, like 90%-ish seem to be the pleasurable, blissful type, and then some 10%-ish, as far as we know, are distressing. Maybe you could say a few words about that.
Sure, I was dragged into that by Nancy Evans Bush, because when we first started doing this work back in the 70s and early 80s, all we heard about were the blissful experiences. We didn't hear about the unpleasant ones. And Nancy, who became the executive director of IANS very early on, had actually had an unpleasant, a frightening near-death experience. And when she told me about this, we weren't sure what to do with this. It sounded like a near-death experience. But some other people were doubting that it really was. They thought maybe it's just a reaction to her anesthesia. So she challenged me to really study it with her. And the two of us launched a study. We collected eventually 50 of these cases, which wasn't easy to do because people aren't willing to talk about these things. And we analyzed the cases and got it published in a mainstream medical journal. And since then, the field has been opened up and we've studied more and more of these. Most people who study this come up with a figure between 1% and 5% of NDEs being unpleasant. But we suspect that there's a lot more out there that just don't want to talk about it. So we don't really know how common it is. Now, Nancy has gone on to write now, I believe she's on a third book about how to deal with these experiences. And she argues, and I think she's got good evidence for this, that you can learn as much from these experiences as you can from the blissful ones. Some people don't experience the same after effects because they try not to deal with it. They try to push it out of their minds. It's such an unpleasant thing to deal with. But she argues that if you deal with it properly, then you can use it as a tremendous growth experience and get the same after effects that any other near-death experiencer can.
Yeah. And I remember you had invited me to your group in Farmington when I was first doing my research. And there I heard for the first time in person someone who had a distressing experience. And they were a perfect example of it had been a horrible experience. And yet this was like 5 years later. And they described themselves as transformed in very positive ways and attributed absolutely to the distressing experience. And that's why Barbara Romer, another MD, titled her book Blessings in Disguise, because they seem on the face of it to be horrible and what good could come of it, and actually much good can come of it. Again,
Sure.
if, as Nancy said, people are willing to process the experience.
Right.
Yeah.
We should not have been surprised by that because we have records of Catholic saints, St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, who talked about the dark night of the soul. And these were exemplary people who had these horrible experiences. And Joseph Campbell wrote about the hero's journey. We have to go through all sorts of horrible tortures to eventually achieve enlightenment.
Yeah.
So it should not have been surprising to us to hear about these things.
Yeah, good point. So one of the pervading debates in the field of consciousness is the relationship between mind and brain.
Right.
And I wonder what you'd like to say about what NDEs, how NDEs inform that debate.
Right. Well, we often hear materialist scientists saying, well, it's just lack of oxygen to the brain, or it's drugs given to people, or it's chemicals produced in the brain, or it's abnormal activity in the temporal lobe. And it gets annoying after a while. It's like, this is the explanation of the month club, But I actually have a lot of sympathy for feeling because I started out as a materialist. And there's a part of me that still wants to find a simple explanation for this. So I take them very seriously. And I don't dismiss them. I say we need to gather the data to look at whether it's true or not. And we have done this. And for every hypothesis that's been proposed that we can test, we found that the data contradict that hypothesis. For example, Mike Sabom here in this country and Sam Parney, who was then in England, actually measured oxygen levels in people when they were in near-death states. And they find that those who have near-death experiences actually have more oxygen going to their brains than people who don't have NDEs. And the similar thing is true of people who are given drugs when they're near death. The more drugs you're given, the less likely you are to have a near-death experience. So these are not hallucinations brought on by hypoxia or drugs. Now, some of the explanations that have been proposed, like a DMT-like drug that's produced in the brain at the point of death, we really can't test because you're talking about a chemical that's produced in tiny amounts for a very short period of time in some part of the brain we don't even know. So how are you going to possibly test this when someone is at a near-death state, being resuscitated probably? You can't go in there and sample all parts of the brain and figure out what's going on in there. So we're sort of stuck with, it's plausible, we have no evidence for it.
Hmm. And what about the argument that although in many cases we have a record that what the person's reporting from their near-death experience seems to have occurred while there was no measurable electrical activity in the brain, but the argument that, well, maybe there's some activity going on that isn't being measured.
Right. Well, we know that in cardiac arrest, within 4 or 5 seconds, your brain waves start diminishing, and within 12 to 20 seconds, they flatline. And we have lots of near-death experiences reported in people who have cardiac arrests. So we know that if their brains aren't totally flat at the time, they're at least largely diminished when they have this near-death experience. And as far as neurophysiologists are aware, they think you need an intact cerebral cortex to have higher consciousness. The fact that EEGs show no activity means there's no activity in the cortex. And they argue, well, maybe there's some activity at the lower bases of the brain that aren't measured by the EEG. Well, that may be, but that type of activity cannot produce consciousness. You need coordinated activity across different parts of the cerebral cortex to have consciousness, they say. Now that raises the question of what is consciousness and where is it? And we always assume that the mind is what the brain does, that the brain creates all our thoughts and our feelings and our perceptions. And in everyday life, that seems to be true. You know, when we get drunk, our brains get inebriated and we don't think very well. When you hit on the head or have a stroke, that affects your thinking. So it seems like the mind and the brain are the same thing, or that the mind is created by the brain. But in near-death experiences, we have the mind functioning often better than ever when the brain is diminished or not functioning. And people who have near-death experiences often say, I felt tremendously free when I got out of the brain. And I could experience a greater range of consciousness than I could when I'm stuck back in this body again. Mm-hmm. And that kind of raises the question about, is there a mind that is separate from the brain? And I should add that there's other evidence for this as well, besides near-death experiences. In terminal lucidity, people who have end-stage dementia, who have not been able to recognize family for months or years and can't communicate, they suddenly become lucid in the last hours before they die. They can communicate with people, carry on coherent conversations, recognize family, and there is no medical explanation for this. You can't regenerate a brain that's got Alzheimer's disease, and yet they suddenly become clear as their brain is deteriorating and they end up dying shortly thereafter. We also have evidence from psychedelic drug trips. We used to assume that these drugs work by stimulating the brain to hallucinate. But neuroimaging of the last decade, particularly at Johns Hopkins University in the US and Imperial College in London, have shown that with a variety of psychedelic drugs, the more elaborate mystical experiences with these drugs are accompanied by a decrease in electrical activity in the brain. So again, it's like the brain is getting out of the way so the mind can flourish. Now, this is counterintuitive for most of us, but it's not a new idea by any means. Hippocrates wrote about this 2,000 years ago. He said the brain is the messenger or the interpreter of the mind. And it's kind of been a minority opinion among neurophysiologists for 2,000 years. That raises the question of what is the mind? Where is it? And how does it relate to the brain? And I don't have answers for that. I have no idea. On the other hand, we don't have an explanation for how the brain can create the mind.
Yeah.
No one has ever come up with an idea of how an electrical or chemical process in the brain can create a thought. It's just assumed it can somehow, but we don't know how.
Yeah. And then another source of evidence in this area is veridical perception in near-death experiences. And maybe you could define what that is and talk about that.
Right. This is something that you have really done a lot of research on. People who claim to leave their bodies and see things from an out-of-body perspective. And in many cases, we can verify that it really happened. And in fact, in your study of dozens and dozens of cases, you found that 92% were corroborated as being totally accurate.
Yeah.
If even one was accurate, that would be astounding, but to have almost all of them, that is astounding. Let me give you one example that was most impressive to me. This is Al Sullivan, who was a 55-year-old truck driver who had emergency quadruple bypass surgery. 4 of the vessels around his heart had been clotted, and he had to have emergency surgery to correct those. And he said that in the operation, he left his body and looked down and saw his surgeon flapping his elbows like he was trying to fly. Now, when Al told me this, it just struck me as ludicrous. I had been a doctor about 30 years at this point, and I had never seen or heard of anyone doing anything like this. You don't see doctors on TV doing that. So I assumed he was hallucinating, but he insisted it was true. And with his permission, I talked to his surgeon. And his surgeon, rather sheepishly, admitted to me, yes, he had done that. He had developed this idiosyncratic habit that no one else had ever seen. He had never seen anyone else do it. While his assistants start the operation, he gets on his sterile gown and gloves, comes into the operating room to watch what his assistants are doing. And he doesn't want to touch anything that's not in the sterile field. So he places his hands where he knows they won't touch anything, flat against his chest. And he points things out to his assistants using his elbow so he won't touch them with his fingers. And it's just like Al was saying, he's trying to fly. There was no way Al could have known about that. And yet he described it accurately, a veridical out-of-body perception. And if this is all a hallucination produced by something going wrong in the brain, how can you see things accurately? And as I said before, you've documented many, many of these cases.
Yeah. And if I could do a little plug, the International Association for Near-Death Studies has recently published a book called The Self Does Not Die, where we've compiled all the cases that we could find involving paranormal phenomena associated with NDEs that were verified as accurate by credible third parties, usually the attending physician in the case. And so it's for me, very impactful even now to read one case after another from all different parts, people who don't know each other and that sort of thing. And it's really kind of amazing. And especially when as you say, what the person perceived was idiosyncratic, something that they would not have expected or that even contradicted their expectations and yet is shown to be accurate. And another category of these is people who see someone not known to have died in their NDE. And I wonder if you have any case of that you particularly like.
Yeah. Many people see in the near-death experience deceased loved ones. And those are often dismissed by debunkers by saying, well, if this is expectation, wishful thinking, of course you wanted to be reunited with loved ones, so you imagined that. But we have a number of cases where someone saw a deceased individual who was not known at the time to be dead, so there's no expectation. And we actually have cases going back to the ancient world. Pliny the Elder wrote about a case like this in the 1st century that was well documented from his perspective. But the most impressive one that I was involved in was a fellow who was hospitalized at age 25 with severe pneumonia, and he kept having respiratory arrest where he'd stop breathing. And he had one particular nurse who he was very fond of, who was about his age. who would be caring for him most days. And one day she told him she was going to be going away for a long weekend and he wouldn't see her for a while. So he wished her well and she took off. And the next day he had another respiratory arrest where he had to be resuscitated. And at that event, he had a near-death experience. And in his NDE, he found himself in a pastoral scene. And to his surprise, there was his nurse, Anita, walking towards him. So he said, what are you doing here, Anita? And she told him basically, this is where I am now, but you can't stay here. You need to go back. And I want you to tell my parents that I wrecked the red MGB. And then she turned and walked away. Well, he then woke up back in his body after he was being resuscitated. And he told the next nurse that he saw about this experience, which he remembered vividly. She was visibly shaken, started to cry, and walked out of the room. He later learned that this nurse of his had taken the weekend off because it was her 21st birthday. And her parents had come into town and had surprised her for her birthday with a red MGB. She got excited, jumped in the car, took off down a hill, lost control of the car and crashed into a telephone pole and died instantly. Now, there's no way he could have known or expected that she was dead, and certainly no way he could have known how she died, and yet he did. Mm-hmm. And that's hard to explain if these are just hallucinations caused by a sick brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I noticed in the chat someone had asked whether Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had ever been involved in research on NDEs, and she was, and she also reported some of these cases, like a boy who was brought in. He had been in a car accident with his brother and his mother. The mother had died on the scene, but the two brothers survived, but they sent them to different ERs, so neither would be overwhelmed. And while she was treating the one in her ER, he regained consciousness. She asked him how he was, and he said fine, that he'd just been with his mother and his brother, and he was going to go be with them again. And she was like, well, she wasn't going to contradict him. So she was like, oh, yeah, that's fine. He lost consciousness again and died. And then as she was leaving the room, walked by the nurse's station, the phone rang, and the nurse answered, and she said, oh, Dr. Kubler-Ross, this is for you. And it was the other hospital calling to say that the brother had died some 30 minutes before. So at the time her patient had his NDE, the brother had already been dead, but nobody knew that. And so it's the same kind of case. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So what is this tell us about even the question of postmortem survival? What do you think NDEs indicate?
Well, again, I'm a skeptic still, and I don't take anything that I think I know as being the truth. I think it's probably going to happen, but I'm not sure. I can't be for sure. And one of the problems is that most near-death experiences say that there are no words to describe what they went through. So I don't take, therefore, anything they say as being the literal truth because there are no words for it. So when they tell me what happened, I take that as kind of a metaphor or a rough description of what they went through, but I don't necessarily take it as literal. So I do think, from what they say, that there is something after death, that death is not the end of our consciousness. But what it is, I don't know. I think it's going to be something that I can't imagine at this point. And I'm willing to be surprised when I get there, if I do. Now, if you certainly have evidence, as we do, that the mind can function when the brain doesn't seem to be able to function, that opens up the possibility that it can still function after the brain dies. And I think that's what these NDEs are telling us, particularly those NDEs in which you see a deceased loved one who's been dead for quite a while. So that's evidence that something about that person who died is still around.
Yeah, good point. Because near-death experiencers, none of them ever stayed dead. So we can't know for sure what happens once the brain is completely dead. But that indication of people, disembodied, deceased people appearing years later indicates that there is some continuity of consciousness continuing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what is your, where do you think that the field of near-death research is going next? And like, what's your greatest concern about the field? What's your greatest hope for the field? That kind of thing.
Yeah, actually, I don't have concerns at all about this field. I think it's a really vibrant field that's growing. My interest as a psychiatrist has always been in how it affects people's lives. And the work that I'm most excited about now is work I'm doing with one of my colleagues, Marietta Pilovanova, looking at people who have near-death experiences and have difficulty with it afterwards. And we're looking at what types of problems they have that make them come to seek help, what type of help they seek, what type of helpers they seek it from, and then what do they find as helpful and not helpful about the help they get. And we're hoping eventually to develop some guidelines for how to work most effectively with people who have difficulty with near-death experiences. Now, fortunately, as you well know, there's another generation following us of younger researchers from Belgium to New Zealand who are carrying on large programs in near-death research with areas of expertise that I certainly don't have. They're bringing to it cross-cultural perspectives, physiological perspectives that are beyond my expertise. So I can't imagine where the field is going in the next 20, 30 years. But I have no doubt that it's growing, and it's going to be far more rich than it is right now.
Yeah. And your mention of cross-cultural, maybe it's worthwhile for the audience to know that what we're seeing cross-culturally is that the same elements that we found in Western near-death experiences, which are the ones that have been studied the most, are appearing in other cultures, very different cultures, Eastern cultures. We have evidence from like Iran and China and I don't know, maybe you can think of more that
Sure.
indicate that, and Jeff Long has been very instrumental in through his Near-Death Research Foundation and www.nderf.org. You can
Right.
read a lot of cross-cultural near-death experiences there.
Yeah, there's been studies done in several different Asian countries,
Mhm.
some Buddhist, some Hindu, that are just like the ones we see here. Although people may again use different words, different metaphors for describing
Yeah.
this phenomenon they have, but the same phenomenon. And
Yeah.
in fact, if you go back over the centuries, you see similar accounts from ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt that sound just like NDEs produced today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for years, when someone has asked me if I were going to read just one book about near-death experiences to try to, get a good feel for them, which one should I read? And I've always, for years now, recommended Ken Ring and Evelyn Elsasser's book, Lessons from the Light, because they did write it for people who had not had near-death experiences and to inform them. But now I have to say, Ken's being displaced, that whenever someone asks me that question now, I'm going to say, read Bruce Greyson's book After, because it will provide the best overview along with really great examples from his archives of near-death experiencers. And I really think yours is the single best book now for educating people who are not as knowledgeable about NDEs. Though I have to say, as much as I know about them, I'm listening to your book on Audible, which, by the way, folks, if you prefer to listen rather than read, you can just get it from Audible. And I am loving it. I'm so happy to get into my car now and run an errand because I can hear the next little excerpt from your book. So it's really a fascinating, or a really invaluable contribution to our field and to humanity. I think it's going to be a contribution in a shift in paradigm for the world. So that's my endorsement.
Thank you, Gina. It's very kind of you to say that.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right. What a fascinating conversation. One of the thoughts that occurs to me, Bruce, is that you are providing, in your book, providing wonderful information for those of us that maybe want to help others understand the breadth of who we are. we can talk more authoritatively when we know that our viewpoints are supported by research. So I think you and Jan and others are making a fantastic contribution to what some of us perceive as a growing awareness of all we are. That I kind of look at things and think, well, you say it doesn't fit in, you can't get to a point where your skepticism isn't completely set aside. I kind of look at it and think, what science haven't we uncovered yet? What forms of energy are we not aware of?
Yes.
And that's maybe where some of this new generation of researchers will come in. It's science all the way through. It's like the electromagnetic spectrum. For a long time, we thought that it was only the lights that we could see, the colors we could see, but now we understand it so much more. Science evolves, and I think that we're going to see more and more understanding of the technology behind it. How does it really work? What is the energy we're talking about? It's not, like I think John Kruth once said, it's a merging of spirituality and science.
Yes.
You don't have to look at it as being one or the other.
Right.
They're going to converge someday.
Yeah.
I want to bring Daniel Endy in. Daniel's going to handle the question and answer period. There are a lot of questions, I think, that have been addressed, but Daniel, can you bring yourself in here? And I'll turn it over to you.
Jim. Hello, Dr. Greyson.
Hi, Daniel.
So we've got quite a lot of questions. I'm going to start with some simple, fast, hopefully fast, quick answers, so we can get through some of those. Also, I will say I've read your book, just finished it today, and it's wonderful because hearing from people who've had experiences is one thing, but hearing from a scientifically minded person taking a skeptical view and finding their way through this material is an entirely different thing. So thank you very much for this
Thank you,
book.
Daniel. Thank you.
So our first question is from Chris Goby. Is there a person or group somewhere or someone I can talk to share their experience? I just joined IANS. Is that a good start? There's a softball for you.
Well, there's lots of places you can do that. I would recommend starting with the IANS website, iands.org, and also Jeff Long's Near-Death Research Foundation website, nderf.org. He has thousands of NDEs narratives up on his website. Now, also, if you're fortunate enough to live in an area where there is an IANS support group, and as Jan said, there's some 70 or 80 in different cities, that's an excellent way to get together with people who are near-death experiences and hear their accounts. And now you can get that online through isgo.ians.org. And there are, as I said, events going on several times a week that you can be part of.
Yes, indeed. ISGO is really great. I recommend it. I also, by the way, lead the Philadelphia chapter of IANS, Friends of IANS. So next question is Nicole Morak. For Dr. Greyson, after all these years of studying NDEs, how has your view of the spiritual world changed since the beginning?
I didn't have one at the beginning. It never occurred to me that there was anything beyond the physical. And I come to appreciate that there must be something, that the physical explanations we have just don't explain very much. Again, since most of the descriptions we have about this spiritual world, if you want to call it that, are heavily colored by cultural metaphors or religious metaphors. And I'm not sure what the truth is behind that. Now, one thing we can do is look at the truths that seem to be consistent across different spiritual traditions. And one of those that comes through most strongly is basically the golden rule, which is a major precept of every single religion we have, that we're all in this together and that you should treat other people the way you want to be treated because we're all the same. You treat someone else and you end up treating yourself the same way. But near-death experiencers say that this is not just a goal we're taught to pursue. This is a law of the universe that they've perceived. This is the way the universe works, like the law of gravity. that you hurt someone else and you end up hurting yourself. So I think I've come to an appreciation of the fact that there is something beyond the physical world. And it's something that continues for us after our bodies die. And it's not something to be afraid of. It's something to be welcomed. Beyond that, I don't really know what to make of it.
Well, your book mentions at least one anecdote of a person who beat someone else up and experienced that themselves. Care to say a word about that?
Sure. This was Tom Sawyer, who had his near-death experience in his 30s when a truck he was working under fell and crushed his chest. And he had a very elaborate life review. And one part of that was when he was a 17-year-old, he was driving his truck down the street and almost hit a drunk man who ran out in front of him. And he stopped the truck and rolled down the window and started yelling at the man, who then reached in the window and slapped Tom across the face, which just was too much for Tom. So he comes out of the car and starts beating the man mercilessly and left him as a crumpled heap on the median strip, and then got back in his truck and went away. Well, in his near-death experience, he relived that not only through his own eyes, but through the eyes of the drunk man. And he watched through the drunk man's eyes Tom's face, his face, getting redder and redder, and then felt each one of the 32 blows in this guy's face. He felt his nose getting bloody. He felt his teeth going through his lower lip, and the humiliation of being beaten up by this young kid. And Tom came away from that thinking that it's really ridiculous to hurt someone else because you know you're hurting yourself, because he obviously felt it from that man's perspective as well. And he decided that the only way to interpret this is that we're all part of the same thing. And it makes no sense to be hurtful towards someone else.
Amen. Our next question is from Nanette Chapman. Do people who experience NDEs ever gain knowledge of why they're here and why we're here and why we experience so much adversity?
That's a great question. And I don't think that can be answered in one evening, let alone one lifetime. I have asked that question of near-death experiences because I'm curious about it. And I don't get what I consider satisfactory answers. They certainly come back with information, but they often say things like, it was perfectly clear to me in the NDE, but now that I'm back here in this brain, I can't seem to process the information. But they do come back with a strong sense that there's a meaning and purpose in everything that happens here. And that the things that we perceive as crises or problems or suffering really have a purpose to them. And there's a meaning that we can't necessarily see all the time. But there are challenges to us to grow from, not just things to try to run away from. So I don't know if I have a great answer for Nicole, but the near-death experiences seem to say clearly there is a meaning and a purpose behind all the things that we perceive here.
Well, I have studied a lot of Emanuel Swedenborg's works, and the Swedenborg Foundation just recently published a free PDF of all the bits of his wisdom relating to tragedy in this life. So I recommend looking up the Swedenborg Foundation. They have a lot of free PDFs. Next question, Claudio Bustamante. Doctor, what is your opinion on reincarnational beliefs among near-death experiencers?
Well, actually, one of Ken Ring's students actually did a study of this. And she found that about a third of near-death experiencers had a firm belief that we do lead multiple lives. However, when she compared this with what's published in the literature about the general population, she found that 1/3 of the general American population also believes in reincarnation. So the near-death experiences were no different from anyone else. However, she did find that their reasons for believing this were different, that most Americans who believe in reincarnation do so because of religious concepts they were taught or things they had read, whereas the experiencers tended to believe this because of things that happened in the NDE. I have heard a few examples of people who went through a life review that seemed to include events from a past life. And in one or two cases, we would be able to verify some of the details they came back with. So I think it's certainly possible that we lead multiple lives and that we were reincarnated, but I don't think I've got enough information about it to be able to say conclusively. I think the models we have of reincarnation are much too simplistic to explain what's really going on.
I'm with you on that. All right, here comes Deanie. Does anyone know when and what was the earliest written record of an NDE by today's understanding or definition?
That's a great question. We certainly have cases going back to ancient Greece. Plato certainly included a dramatic one in the case of error in the Republic. It's hard to know what goes back farther than that. We've found NDEs reported in pre-literate cultures where you have to gather verbal information from them. This has been done with Australian Aborigines, with Polynesian peoples. And in fact, the French fur traders in the 1600s collected cases from the Indians that they met, the American Indians. So they come from all cultures that have been looked at. But we don't know how far back in time they went, because much before ancient Greece, we didn't have a written language to communicate these.
Very good. The next question is from Raven. In your experience, is the content and quality of an NDE influenced by beliefs, and to what extent?
That's an excellent question. We have not found the occurrence of an NDE or the raw contents of it to be associated with any prior beliefs. However, the way people interpret these events are colored by their beliefs. And let me give you some examples of that. Many people report encountering this warm, loving being of light. And people who grew up in a Christian culture often say that this was God or this was Christ, but they may qualify that by saying, well, it's not the God I was taught about in church. It's much bigger than that. But you can use the word God because then you know what I'm talking about. But I've also talked to people from Hindu and Buddhist cultures who say the same thing about a warm, loving being of light, but they don't call it God. They may call it nothing. They may call it a Yamdud or some type of other spirit, or they may just say it was a being of light without being able to qualify it.
So it's put into terms one can understand, let's say.
Yes.
The next question is from Lindsay Francisco. There are also those who return and are depressed, yes, because they feel that it's better over there. Is there any research around this, and did they have a qualitatively different NDE?
Yeah. There's no research per se, but there's lots of anecdotes that people have collected. I certainly know many people who were either sad or angry that they were brought back to this life because they thought the other life was such a perfect place to be, and this one is full of pain and disappointment, and they don't want to be here. I will say that often doesn't stay with them very long. And one of the best remedies for that is to get together with other near-death experiencers in one of these support groups and talk about these feelings and see how other people have dealt with them. Because one of the messages of many NDEs is that you need to make the most of whatever situation you're in. And when they're coming back here to this life, even though it seems to be on the surface a horrible place to be, there are things you can do here to make it a more loving place and make it more like the place you want to be. And I think that's what many people say that is their goal when they come back to this life, to try to bring back some of the love they felt in that other realm to this world where it's so lacking.
Yes, indeed. So here's one from Daft Tom. What is the longest recorded amount of time that someone has been near death and experienced an NDE, but was still fully functional upon being revived?
Well, it kind of depends on how you define being near death. Just in the past decade or so, neurosurgeon Eben Alexander was in a coma created by a bacterial infection in his brain for 6 days. And he was given a 1% chance of surviving and 0 chance of surviving in a functional way. And today he's perfectly fine. He's giving talks that are better than mine. He's very eloquent. He's written several books. Seems to be functioning just fine. Now, there was a case of a Russian physicist, George Rodonaya, who was killed in a car accident. And he was actually in the morgue for 3 days. And then when they took him out to embalm him, he seemed to revive and woke up. And he had a dramatic story about a near-death experience. And he managed to, shortly after that, be smuggled out of Russia and came to the States, where he became a preacher. And he's now an itinerant preacher in Texas, going from church to church.
And also, I'm forgetting her name, the kayaker.
Again?
The kayaker, the woman who was on a kayak.
Oh, yes, Mary Neal.
Yes.
Yes, she was kayaking in a remote area in Chile and was trapped upside down at the bottom of a waterfall, deep in the water. And she was there for about 30 minutes. And normally you cannot survive underwater for 30 minutes. Now, it's true that if you're in cold water, which presumably she was, your body has this diving reflex that slows down your metabolism and is somewhat protective. But 30 minutes is a long time to be down there without air. And yet she survived, and now she is fully functional again, written 2 excellent books and does a lot of talking. She's a frequent talker at IONS meetings.
Yes, very good. So now we have one from Jeanette Bauer. This should be up your alley. My question would be, if he had experiences with patients that were either schizophrenic or bipolar, that then had an NDE that came back from their experience more grounded and somewhat cured?
That's a good question. I have had patients with psychotic illnesses who had near-death experiences. And it's interesting that after they've been treated for their illness, they recognize that their hallucinations were in fact illusory, that they weren't real, but they continue to maintain that the near-death experience was ultra real. So they differentiate between the hallucinations and the real visions of the near-death experience. The drugs we give them to control their illness eliminates the belief in the hallucinations, but not in the NDE. Now, the question about whether that cures their illness, I have to say I have not seen that to be the case. I've seen people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia who are still subject to the illness despite having had a near-death experience.
Very good. Now, this is from Hannah Preisinger. How much precedent is there of non-local shared death experiences, i.e. a third party in a distant location deliberately witnessing and feeling the death of another through energetic means and subsequently communicating messages to the family?
There's a long history of cases like this reported in the British Society for Psychological Research and the American Society for Psychological Research, of people who remotely knew at the time of someone's death that they were passing. And sometimes they would see a vision of the person who was passing. Now, I'm not sure if she was asking just about that, about getting the information, or about a shared near-death experience where you actually start going through the NDE with the dying person. And there are some cases of that, but I don't know if that's remote. They're usually someone who is with the dying person and feels that they start going through the same process with them, and then they may be sent back at some point and not allowed to progress any further.
And Dr. Raymond Moody wrote a book on that, correct?
Right, right.
So folks might want to look that up if they're interested in that subject. This is very interesting from Chris Goby. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I had an NDE at the age of 17. I had many disabilities prior to the NDE, and after the NDE, these disabilities disappeared. I am 62 now and the COO of a management company. I've had an angelic life since, but I find it very difficult to find folks like me to talk to on a daily basis. Are there any?
Yeah.
So I think the ISGO answer
Yeah, yeah. I think again, going to IONS is the best way to reach other people through ISCO or through other IONS resources. Um, I do know people who have had disabilities seem to be corrected by a near-death experience. I know people who haven't also, who have maintained their disabilities. But I've seen people who had hearing loss that seemed to be corrected afterwards. One person had a thyroid tumor that seemed to be corrected. And one of the most dramatic examples is Anita Morjani, who had Hodgkin's disease and had tumors throughout her body and was thought to be dying, in the process of dying, was in her hospital. Her family was called to be with her. And she ended up having a dramatic near-death experience. And the next day, they found no evidence of cancer anywhere in her body. And that's the most stunning example I know of someone who had a miraculous recovery after a near-death experience.
Are you aware of Mellon Thomas Benedict's story?
Yes, yeah.
He supposedly recovered in a similar way from brain cancer.
Yeah.
Well, the same person, Chris, asks a follow-up. What about the pocket of neurons in the heart theory? Does that ring a bell? The pocket of neurons in the heart.
There are neurons throughout the body. And lately there's been a lot of research looking at the neurons in our gut, in our GI system, which seem to have an influence on moods. So there is some connection between these neural networks throughout the body and those in the brain. But there's no evidence saying that these other neural networks, whether they're in the heart or in the gut, have anything to do with consciousness per se. They may affect our bodily functions and some of the alertness that we have in the brain, some of our moods, but not thought, not perceptions, not consciousness.
Are those connected, the gut and the heart, through the vagus nerve? Are you aware of the vagus?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, so that's something else for our attendees to look into.
Yes.
All right, we have a question from Ted St. John, which is there a way to contact Bruce directly?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, you can do it through my website, www.brucegreysson.com.
Very good. All right, now we have Sheila Franklin asks, do you see any correlation between UFO abduction memories and NDEs? Often there is the same euphoric experience with angelic-looking beings.
That's an interesting question, and several people have tried to look into this. Ken Ring actually wrote a book about this, in which he pointed out the similarities between UFO abduction accounts and near-death experiences. And he got so much anger directed at him for writing this book from near-death experiencers who didn't want to be lumped with those crazy UFO people, and from UFO abductees who didn't want to be lumped with those crazy near-death experiencers. The way I understand this is that many people have a sense in their near-death experience of encountering unidentified beings that seem sort of human, but not quite. And what your cultural belief tells you shapes how you interpret that. And in past generations, they might have said these were angels or some other types of demigods or beings. And in the 21st century, in the 20th century, we're more likely to say these were extraterrestrials. They're almost human, but not quite. I don't know what they are, but they're interacting with us. So I'm not sure whether it's the same thing or not. I don't know really how to interpret these.
Okay. Our next question is from Robbie Bennett. Robbie asks, says, hello, Bruce. Thanks for taking the time here. I have a few questions. Number one, can you tell us one of the strongest NDE cases you are aware of?
I'm going to beg off on that.
Okay.
Because I can't do that without minimizing other NDEs. And I can't say that I've heard a single NDE that wasn't really profound for the person who had it. So, the ones I've talked about earlier were the most effective in convincing me to change my thoughts. But I think that each NDE I've heard has been so profound for the person who had it that I don't want to diminish them.
You're a lovely man. So Robbie further asks, why don't more people have and or remember near-death experiences?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Our data seem to suggest that when people have a cardiac arrest, about 10 to 20% of those will report a near-death experience. Does that mean that more had them but forgot them? I don't know. And we don't know why some people have them and some people don't. We've tried to look at different variables, and we really haven't found any way of predicting who's going to have a near-death experience given the exact same physiological events.
So Robbie is a prolific questioner. His next one is, what is the next step for NDE research?
Well, as I mentioned with Jan, I think the next steps are going to be taken by the next generation who has different ideas, different interests, different expertise areas than I do. I think you're going to see a lot more done with the cross-cultural exploration of NDEs, the overlap between NDEs and other types of mystical or spiritual experiences, and some of the physiological correlates of near-death experiences that make them possible, or that seem to be associated with them.
Thank you. All right. This is Dave Dale. Bruce, are you aware of the physicist Thomas Campbell and his book, My Big Toe, My Big Theory of Everything?
Yes.
If yes, could you comment on the similarities or differences between what you have discovered and what Tom theorizes?
I really can't. You know, My Big Toe is one of the thickest books I've ever read. And it would take me a long time to even summarize his main points. But he does have a lot of overlaps between what he conceives as a model for the universe and what near-death experiencers come back reporting.
So that leads into this question from Darcy, from Darcy or Sabrina, I'm not sure, it's confusing. Hello, my question about NDEs. Do you think that people who claim they have out-of-body experience, astral projection, are experiencing the same kind of dimension or astral realm that people with NDEs had experienced? I wonder about this sometimes.
That's good to wonder about it. I have no idea how you go about testing that. You know, they certainly seem to report leaving this realm. I don't know how to measure where they're going or what they're seeing, but they report the same types of things often that near-death experiencers do. I will say, however, that near-death experiencers seem much more profoundly affected by their experience. People who have out-of-body experiences, either because they're trying to induce them through guided meditation or drugs or through other practices, or who have them spontaneously but recurrently, often don't seem to be as powerfully impacted by them as near-death experiencers do. And that may be partly because the near-death experience is so totally unexpected. You're not prepared for it, you're not trying to achieve it, and it takes you more by surprise, and therefore may have a bigger impact on you.
Our next question is Mary Ann Martini, says, has Dr. Greyson experienced any of the after effects of actual NDEs or NDEers, though he may not have had one himself?
That's an interesting question. You know, there's been some research actually looking at students who are taught about near-death experiences. There have been 4 studies of college students who took a course in NDEs, 1 study of nursing students, and actually 1 study of high school students. And they all found that students who learned about NDEs became more compassionate in their attitudes and actually more altruistic in their behaviors up to a year after the course was over. And I think that most researchers, including myself, adopt some of these same attitudes and beliefs. So in a very small sense, we absorb some of the lessons of the near-death experience. Now, we don't have the experiential encounter with this other realm. So it doesn't hit us as this is the way it has to be. It's just for us more of this is what they think we should be like, and we try to achieve that. So I don't say it's the same thing as an NDE, but I think it's in the same ballpark, that we're going in the same direction.
Agreed. This question, I'm not sure if this will make sense, uses some terminology I've never heard before. It's from Mickey. Has anyone done any research on biomechanical compression and the relationship of a created pseudo-personality having this experience and not the individual itself?
I'm afraid I'm as lost as you are, Daniel. I don't
Okay,
know.
we'll
question.
pass on that. Glad to see I'm not alone. This is Glenna. Is there any information covering why some people don't or can't have these experiences?
Well, generally speaking, there isn't. However, there's some evidence that people who are more open to exploring their inner worlds, such as people who remember their dreams more often, are more likely to remember the details of a near-death experience. And those people who are traditionally more closed off to their inner worlds, who have a hard time identifying with what their feelings are, tend not to be able to describe their near-death experiences very well. That doesn't mean they didn't have them, but they don't really experience them as fully as other people might, and they certainly don't talk about them as much as other people do.
I see. This is from Darcy. Rupert Sheldrake mentioned that materialism is becoming more passé in the scientific medical community. Yay. The tables appear to be turning in that thinking. Do you agree?
I do. I've seen tremendous improvement in the attitudes of physicians in the decades that I've been doing this work. There have been some studies recently done in Scotland, in Belgium, and in Brazil of scientists' attitudes towards the mind-brain question. And up to half of all the scientists in all three countries say that the mind and the brain are not the same thing, and that the mind can function independent of the brain. And that is clearly a dramatic change in the belief in materialism that wasn't there just 50 years ago.
All right, with this one, it's from an anonymous person. Has Dr. Greyson encountered any NDE accounts in which the experiencer reported interactions with alien beings?
As I said before, there are some people who encounter unidentified beings that they may then later identify as being extraterrestrials. But I'm not sure what to make of that. I think that it's more of a cultural interpretation they put on these unknown beings.
Now, Darcy wants to know where she can get an autographed copy of your book.
Tell her to contact me through my website. I'll be happy to do that for her.
BruceGreyson.com, Greyson with an E.
Right.
E-R-E. Here is from Sharon. Didn't Tom Sawyer come back with an understanding of physics?
This was very interesting. Understanding may be too strong a word, but he had been a kind of a clown in high school and bragged about never reading a book once he got out of school. And after he had his NDE in his 30s, he suddenly became a voracious reader. And he would go to the library and just read physics books, one after another. And it's something that would be totally foreign to him before his NDE. So he became extremely interested in these types of things, in cosmological interpretations of the universe. I never got into a discussion with him about how he understood it, but he certainly found it much more interesting than he did before his NDE.
This person goes on saying he kept saying something about Max Planck. Is that true?
Yes, he read a lot about and by Max Planck, was one of the founders of quantum physics. Yeah.
All right, let's see. Now that you're retired, what will you focus on in the NDE area?
Well, I'm still a psychiatrist at heart, and I'm focusing mostly on how these experiences affect people's lives, both in positive ways and in unpleasant ways, and ways that we can help them come to terms with some of these problems they have after an NDE.
This question's from Don Allison. What are some studies you would recommend that debunk skeptics' claims that NDEs are due to lack of oxygen to the brain or due to hallucinations caused by their drugs? You do mention this in your book.
I did, and I think the best way to deal with these skeptical questions is just by looking at the data, because that's the one thing that a skeptic is supposed to appreciate and value. So you need to collect data to bear on the question. Look at the oxygen levels and the drugs given to people and see what their association is with near-death experiences or not.
Very good. I haven't pre-read this one, so Cloud Gazer Z, if you have been more predisposed to telekinetic abilities or energy work in your life and you have had an NDE, would it enhance those abilities? I've been working on Qi energy work as well as the Monroe Institute program, and I'm curious as to how they might interact.
I don't know the answer to that. You know, certainly many people after a near-death experience say that they have new abilities. Some report electromagnetic effects on their bodies, and others report healing effects. As far as I'm aware, no one has done any rigorous investigation, no research into these, but there's certainly a lot of anecdotes about it.
Okay. This one's from Carol Hubbard. What explanation do you have for someone like me who has no knowledge of an early life NDE, but from the age of 3 until my 40s had repeated dreams where I knew from the colors I saw, the utter peace of the place, the individuals I encountered, and the intense grief I felt upon waking, that I had been on the other side. This also had led to seeing and conversing with transitioned loved ones, my parents and friends, from my late 20s onward.
I'm afraid I don't have an explanation for that. You're not the first person who has mentioned things like this. I know that people report these things, often coming from a very early age, but I don't know that we have an explanation for it.
Okay, we're getting towards the end here. There's been a lot of great questions.
Yeah.
Here we have a similar one. I cannot recall an NDE, but when I hear others' NDEs, it seems to trigger a memory and certainty. That is exactly how it was, and yet I cannot recall it. Has there been any research into children's forgotten and remembered NDEs?
And again, not research per se. There certainly are a lot of accounts of things like this, of people who act as if they've had a near-death experience in childhood, and yet they don't remember it. So some people assume that they must have had one, or else they wouldn't be like this, but I'm not sure we have the evidence for that. There's certainly lots of other ways of getting to this spiritual realm, to this spiritual belief system without having a near-death experience. That's just one of the most common ways of getting there. But there are other ways of having these mystical experiences. And it's possible that something else happened to this person when she was young that led her to this information.
Indeed. This is from Mary Ann Martini. Does it seem that the light experienced in NDEs has a profound healing effect where patients are often healed or found to be in remission? Thank you for all you do.
Well, there are some dramatic cases of people who were healed after a near-death experience. I don't know what aspect of the NDE actually did that. There aren't enough of them that we've studied to be able to look at a large number and say this was always present when they got better and this was not. There are just too few cases that we've been able to look at.
Sam Sorensen wants to know, has there been any thought about inducing NDEs in a lab in a similar way to the movie Flatliners, in a controlled, safe way? Of course, there would be major risks, but has the idea been explored?
People have tried to find, quote, safe ways of doing this with guided meditation, with hypnosis, with psychedelic drugs, again, with guidance. And they have not been totally successful. I think part of the reason for that is that an important part of the near-death experience is the unexpected aspect of it. And if you're trying hard to get the experience, you're not sort of letting go. And an important part of the experience is being out of control and feeling that you're okay, even though you're not in control of things. That the essential part of you that is experiencing this is not the part that needs to be in control the way your ego is all the time. And that you can let go of this ego control and still be good, still be fine. And I think if you're trying to have the experience, you're never really letting go and letting yourself be in that egoless state, which is so important.
Mm-hmm. This is somewhat related. Is an NDE like a psychedelic experience?
Well, in some ways it is. People who have had both a psychedelic experience and an NDE often describe it as the psychedelic experience is a way to mimic the NDE. It's not the same thing. And they describe it to, if you ask someone who's been in combat to describe what they saw and felt and heard in battle, and then you ask someone who watched a war movie what they saw and felt and heard while watching the movie, they may use the same words. And it sounds like they're talking about the same experience, but nobody would confuse the two. One is an image of the other or a mimic of the other. Now, having said that, some of the research done at Johns Hopkins just recently with psilocybin have shown that up to a year after a single dose of psilocybin, people have profound after effects, including a profound loss of fear of death. So there may be more to the psychedelic experience that we haven't really uncovered yet.
Very good. This is Jenny Lopez. As a psychology student, what field would you recommend I go into so I can research certain subjects intertwining metaphysics and spiritual knowledge and psychology? Any institutions you might recommend?
Well, I would say that the discipline you're in now, psychology, is a great one to do that in. There are contributions to this from psychology, from sociology, from religious studies, from neuroscience, and all those would be helpful ways to start. You can certainly get that through a psychology program. In terms of what institutions, I really can't say because it depends so much on the individuals at the institutions who are willing to mentor you in this, and that's going to change from year to year. So I think when you're ready to embark on this, you need to look at the individuals you want to study with, not the institution.
Very good. Looks like we're about to be interrupted. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to ask you the questions.
Thank you, Daniel, for moderating all these questions.
I'm back, Bruce. This has been just a fantastic evening. I'm hoping that people who've been attending tonight are learning, are being prepared to be proponents of we need to be understanding of near-death experiencers. Probably a lot of people in our audience are near-death experiencers.
So,
I'd also just like to restate, I think our sponsors has some great programs. The Rhine Center has online education programs, more in parapsychology than near-death experiences. But visit the Rhine website to learn more about their programs. The Monroe Institute, people have been chatting about experiences. I had a conversation with Scott Taylor, who you know. Scott put together a program at the Monroe Institute that was intended to mimic the near-death experience. And Scott says he's had some success with that. So check out the Monroe Institute. And IANS, IANS has been around for a long time. They have a symposium coming up. We've been hampered, the organization's been hampered by the coronavirus, but every year they've had these in-person conferences. And if you want to meet an interesting group of people, you ought to find a way to get to one of these conferences. Jose Hernandez and his inner immersion work. It's not well known what's going on, but I think you're going to hear a lot about Jose in the not too distant future. the lessons that he learned, the artwork that he developed out of his near-death experience. We're hoping to find that in partnership with the Monroe Institute that we can have an impact on people's well-being. You know, in a hospital setting, can we reduce blood pressure? Can we reduce stress? Those types of things will help people have better outcomes. In Consciousness Cafe, I would comment that if you have an interest in having more discussions about these subjects, and you'd be willing to start up a group, we'd be happy to help you. If you visit our website, there you can indicate an interest there. IANS certainly supports new groups. If you tend to be a little bit more near-death oriented, although IANS seems to be expanding their interest beyond just near-death experiences, which is great. So there's some wonderful things going on, and your book is certainly one that I would echo what Jan said. I think it's one that needs to be read. It provides a basis for understanding things, so that if you do run into people who aren't particularly open to this, you can discuss them objectively, and maybe help people understand the breadth of who we are. In my experience, I find that I run into a lot of people who've had after-death communications. This seems to, I run into more after-death communication people than I do near-death experiencers. But like near-death experiencers, people are afraid to talk about these things. We need to create an environment that says it's okay, that these are legitimate experiences, and there are places to go to meet people that appreciate these things. So, Bruce, thank you again. This has been fascinating. Thank you to the panelists. And we've had, I think at one point, 278 participants, which is a huge number. Thank you to all the participants and the questions that have been submitted. You're a fantastic group of people, and I'm guessing that Bruce is feeling pretty good about the state of affairs as he looks at retirement. All the contributions that he and his cohorts have made over the years have set the stage for something even greater.
Thank you, Jim, for creating this wonderful experience for us all.
Mm-hmm. Any panelists want to come in, and Jan, Jose, anybody, Jenny Wedby, come in and make some final comments?
No final comments, just I agree, it's been a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for organizing it, Jim.
Jenny, glad to see you were able to join us from the Monroe Institute.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking.
Jose, any comments you'd like to make?
I thought it was compelling. I thought it was a really engaging conversation. It was great to hear the perspectives from Bruce, somebody studying this for so long. I mean, we have kind of like anecdotal experiences, with my experience. And he's had such a broad stroke of speaking to so many people and getting a richer understanding that it enriches my experience in many ways. It validates a lot of what I actually went through. So it's really nice to hear that. And I hope that everybody out there got to enjoy this program. It's a real good one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, thank you. Keep an eye out for future programs. I know the Consciousness Cafe has some speakers lined up in the coming weeks. Looking out a ways, a name that some people might recognize, Jeff O'Driscoll. I believe we're getting a date set for him in April. Physician who worked in the ER environment, who's seen and experienced some interesting things. The more you meet people who've had experiences, the more you can come to appreciate these things. And I would attest that I'm one person that has an appreciation for Ken Ring's notion of a benign virus. You read these books, and you realize we need to live our lives. Love our neighbors as ourselves. You don't have to have a near-death experience to appreciate that, but it helps to be familiar with the literature, to really let it sink in. So thank you, everybody, for attendance tonight. We're going to bring this to a close, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.